What's going on, everyone? My name is Patrick, and, well, this is my Sony FS100. I've had it for a couple months now, and I've been using it on and off. And in this video, I'm going to kind of talk about it. I guess you could call it a review, but this camera's now 6, 8, 10 years old. I don't even know when it was released. I think 2011 or so. And, well, it's not a normal camera most people would even think about buying. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and give you my thoughts about the camera and tell you why I like it, why I use it, and why, well, you might want to use it too. So there's a lot of different things I can actually talk about with this camera, but I guess the first thing is going to be an introduction to it. Most people probably have no idea what this camera is, what it was for, and I guess where it's at right now. First off, it was kind of the redheaded stepsister of Sony cinema cameras when it was released. At the same time, they released the Sony F3, and not long after, they released the Sony FS100. And this camera was kind of left in the dark. It wasn't a bad camera, but it lacked a lot of the features that the other two had. But again, what it lacked, it was able to make up for some of it. But first, let's talk about the biggest reason why it flopped. Well, first off, in 2011, it was the start of the 4K camera revolution, if you will. And this camera does not have 4K. It's got a 3.1 or 3.4 megapixel sensor with a max resolution of 1080p. Not only that, the second biggest problem that most people had with it was the fact that it had no built-in ND filters. Both the FS700 and the Sony F3 both had built-in NDs. The third big problem with this camera that the other two cameras did not have was that this camera has no Sdi output on it. So it's limited to 1080p, 422 8-bit color for the output. The other two cameras both had up to RAW or 444 output at 10-bit. Obviously a big problem with this camera, especially for, I guess, the market that it was made for. But again, where it lacked certain features like that, it made up for it in a lot of different other places, especially when it comes down to the price of this camera versus the other two. First off, it is a cinema camera. It has all of the features, all the buttons, everything else you would expect from a cinema camera. Not only that, it has two built-in XLR inputs and full manual control of those inputs, along with phantom power, which is huge for a camera like this. Downside being, it doesn't have any internal microphone, but again, that's easy enough to fix with the microphone that it came with it. The lens mount on the front of this thing is an E-mount, which means you can mount just about any lens to it, so long as it doesn't have a shallower lens mount on there. And in terms of recordable media, at the time, it used either SD cards, I think whatever Sony's Pro Duo cards were, and it also has this nice little compartment on the side that allows you to connect up a 128 gig SSD. It has HDMI output, it has headphone output, it has composite, and it has AV output for all of the HD and SDI formats you could want. In terms of recording capabilities, it could do 1080p, it could do 720p, and I think 480i. It could do 24p, 60p, 30p, and if you're in the PAL region, it could do 25 and 50p. It could also overcrank it to, I guess it considers it 120 frames per second, but it's 120 frames per second interlaced, so it's just taking a 60p video stream and I guess duplicating the frames to make it equivalent to 120 frames per second, even though it's only 60 frames per second. It's able to do a couple different nifty features like in-body or in-camera slow motion, like a lot of the current day Sony cameras that can do the 120 frames per second slowed down to 24 frames per second. And it can also do time lapses where 1 or 2 frames per second, then you speed it up to 24, 30, or 60 frames per second. The camera also has built-in land-sea control, which in this case, with the included hand grip, it allows you to have a record start-stop button on there. And honestly, that's kind of the extent of the feature set that most people would even care about. It's got some other built-in things that you can look up on your own, but I'm not going to go through those. The way that I currently have the camera set up, which is, I guess, my favorite setup, is going to be I have a Blackmagic video assist up top, connected up through HDMI. I currently have a Minolta MCMD manual lens on the front of it with a variable ND on the front, and all that's adapted using a K&F concept adapter that's about 15 bucks. I also have a small rig handle on top of it that makes it nice and easy to carry around and handhold. I also have the handle that came with the camera attached to it, which I don't use that often, and it adds a lot of bulk, and honestly, the handle is not comfortable and not ergonomic at all, so I normally don't have it on here. But for now, I have it on here. I kind of like it for now, but I'm sure it'll come off soon enough. So how about the video quality of this thing? Well, it's got a 3.37 megapixel Super 35 sensor that in its time was extremely good, and it's the same sensor out of the PMW F3 and allows for, again, at the time, extremely good low light conditions. The one biggest flaw with the sensor is that in terms of the highlights, it has a tendency of blowing them out extremely quick and extremely early without a decent picture profile, and even with a decent picture profile, you're still going to have some issues with it. Because it has the lens mount, it actually makes it extremely versatile. So if you want to mount any manual old vintage lenses or PL mount or anything on here, you're more than able to. Or if you want to use the autofocus Sony E-mount lenses, you can do that too. It supports autofocus and image stabilization, so you shouldn't have any problems with that, even handheld. In terms of the build quality of it, well, it's a plastic body, and most people would say it's a box. It's a very different design, especially at the time when the big cinema cameras were exactly that, big, and it was a time when DSLRs were massive. I don't think nowadays it necessarily stands out as much, especially when you compare it to the square red bodies that are exactly that, they're boxes. But again, it's different than what most people are used to, so I guess to each their own. I like the design of it. I think it's extremely useful and not ergonomic, but everything is there when and if you need it. Like I said earlier, on the side of it, it has all of the buttons you could possibly need for focus peaking, zebras, color, markers, auto or manual control. It also has auto iris and push to auto focus buttons on here. The biggest problem with the buttons, in my opinion, is changing the iris is a knob that you have to spin on the side of it that is extremely slow and imprecise. And with multiple of my auto lenses, it's more of a pain than anything else. So that, again, makes me go more to my manual lenses than anything else. Touching back on the actual image quality of this thing, I like it. Even with the internal codec being 8-bit and 420, it's completely fine for what I've found. I can actually do a lot with the overall video footage, pulling and making manipulations in terms of color grading without losing too much, but I will say there's a very fine line for when you pull it too far and when the image just starts to fall apart. Even with the external monitor being able to record uncompressed 422 8-bit footage, I honestly find myself recording internal because the difference between the two, at least for my use case, isn't that drastic and doesn't really call for me to make that much of a change. What else can we talk about? We've covered the lens, we've covered the sensor, we've covered the build quality, we've covered kind of the buttons and usability of it, we've covered a lot of the features inside. The image quality, well, honestly, I don't really think there's all that much left. The big thing now is just going to be the actual video examples to show you what it can actually do. So, enjoy. Alright, so first off, this is the actual camera. This is footage coming from the Sony FS100 using the Sony 18-105G lens. This is using full autofocus, manual aperture, and manual everything else. And I also have a microphone up here running through the built-in preamps of the camera. Not using phantom power, but this is it.